Welcome to Lessons for Full Spectrum Humans, Level 2. This lesson is all about the I Am God circuit and redefining death. So in the previous lesson, I was talking all about how the ego fears its own demise. The ego, the temporal self, located at the level of the yellow chakra here and here, is aware that it is temporary. It exists only because of consciousness being submerged in time, and it fears its own unmaking. And I also drew the graphic depiction of ascended mastery. Here's the traditional time vortex, time cone that I draw all the time, and here is the pathway of least likelihood, the one that exits the tiny little wormhole that is over here and actually continues onward to the infinite journey of consciousness. And that really we experience this central core timeline when all of our chakras, like depicted here and depicted here, are in perfect alignment with divinity or higher consciousness, or the overarching entity within which we exist. It's like saying your own thoughts and motivations are perfectly in alignment with this much larger entity of higher consciousness. We could call it God. And in the last portion of the previous lesson, I spoke about how each human is a recipe. Each ego is like a recipe that is made of constituent elements. And the question is, genetically, who is living through your genes? Which vibrations are you picking up? Are you picking up on channel blue? Are you picking up on channel yellow? Are you picking up on channel red? And that really one's ego, the recipe for one's ego, is a amalgamation of these various entities that are speaking to you and through you via the genetic antenna. And I have also described one's DNA as a bridge between the world of pure light and the world of experienced reality. That is also like saying when we look at these, the chakras, the energy field that surrounds a human being, that is the representation of all of the possibilities that surround you and your possible life. Well, in exactly the same way, one's genes and your genetic information represents the possibilities of who you can be. And I also really am starting to describe this overarching shape as a refinery or like a sieve, where only if you are in alignment with this central core persona can you get through the mesh, or can you get through the sieve, can you reach the higher plane of existence. So there are many implications to this simple structure. The implication is that some aspects of consciousness do not merit going on. Those little red dots that I drew as the final moments of the distorted versions of self, those are not, it's not about good, it's not about bad. When I speak about merit, it is more like, does the key fit in the keyhole? It is almost a geometric or spatially or topographically determined feature. If you do not have the right shape, you cannot get through this doorway. And these other personas, these other aspects of self, they can be totally different from who this central timeline is. Like, to give you an example, Hitler, or like the worst mass murderer, insane person you could possibly imagine, that would be one of these far outliers. That would be one of these very extremely distorted versions of a person's life. But if that person, that crazy madman, were refined and did all of this other experience of life, eventually they would hit their ascended master persona. They would be on this timeline going in this direction. They would be a completely different person. This is the idea that consciousness is on a journey of evolution, and when you meet someone, they are still in the process of evolving. So if you meet someone who is over here on this timeline, they are not as evolved as their consciousness will be when it is on this timeline. Now I want to erase and make a little bit of room. These are many ascended master timelines. Okay, drawing them from many different directions. They are all going towards the same central point. This is infinity. So all of these beings are directed towards and connecting to that central timeline. I know I could have drawn it a little bit better. And then here is their membranes of death, their vortexes. The drawing is not perfect, but you are absolutely understanding my concept here, that first of all, the areas in yellow, these timelines, these are when a person is just figuring themselves out. They're just figuring themselves out. On the far outliers, it's like, well, are you a mass murderer? No, I'm not a mass murderer. I'll try again. Okay, are you like just an incredibly selfish person? No, I'm not just incredibly selfish. Okay, we're getting closer, closer, closer. And you work your way up until you reach the ascended master persona. And when you look at this overarching drawing that I made, which of course is a simplification because the number of ascended masters is almost infinite. There's a lot. There's a lot of them. And all of these timelines, core personas, point to that one central point of consciousness. And that central point of consciousness is unity consciousness. It must be understood that unity consciousness is comprised of all of these different individual elements, and that the individual elements are not undistinguished or without characteristics. Like this ascended master over here is coming from a slightly different direction than this one over here. And their consciousness had to go through all of these perturbations to be able to figure out that it is actually this. And this one over here had to go through all of these perturbations in order to figure out that it actually is over, in alignment with this reality. So these are experiencers of the third dimension who have experienced different things but come to the same conclusion. And the conclusion is this core persona here, it recognizes that I am God. And I call it the I am God circuit, because we come from the source, we come from this central unity consciousness, and then energy exits the source and it goes away. And then we have this experience of assembling an ego and whirling and twirling, and assembling a physical form and having experiences in the third dimension and, living in the red chakra, living in the third dimensional density. And then through this process here, we end up circulating back towards the source. We have completed our journey. If this diagram that I am drawing of the journey of consciousness from source and back to source is analogous to the journey of a neuronal impulse within your neurology. So within your brain have these nerves that have, this is one end of the nerve, and then this is the other end of the nerve. And I believe that I have drawn this before in lessons. And you have an impulse, an idea that is like a electrical impulse, and it reaches this end of the nerve. And then there's this little gap here, this little area in between the two nerves, and the energy impulse has to get across this gap. It's called the synapse, and it has to jump across the synaptic gap. And it does it through a means of chemicals, and science talks all about how it does it, but basically it transfers energy from this end of the membrane to this end of the membrane so that it can continue on its journey. Well, this structure that I keep drawing, these time structures here, are analogous to the little neuron impulse trying to reach the synaptic gap, trying to jump across. These blue lines are consciousnesses that have successfully jumped from this end of the synaptic gap to this end. I'm trying to say here, with many words, that one's entire life, one's entire existence as a human or as going through the third dimension is analogous to one little firing of neurons of one little gap in an enormous entity brain, okay? Your entire life is equivalent of the firing of one neuron in a much, much larger brain. And that neuron only fires, the gap is bridged when a thought is achieved. And that thought is, I am God. That is what this timeline is. All of these other experiences, all of these other time possibilities, the person who is not only evil and Hitler, but the person who experiences other levels of distortion, ego, greed, even sadness and sorrow. All of this is exploration of the self, exploration of the identity, self and identity, who you are and who you are not. And at the end of that process of refinement, when you are in alignment with the source, the thought that you are thinking is, I am God. So all of these ascended masters that have existed over the ages, and we are talking about tens, thousands, millions of years, many, many ascended masters. So I'm now going to draw like many, many, many time vortexes are all pointing inward towards this central reality. Many, many people have had the realization, I am God. I came from source. I circulated out here. I had experiences in this time vortex, and then I circulated back. I am God. However, all of these beings had that experience from a slightly different direction. This is the omnidirectional eye of experience. That is God. The omnidirectional eye of God. And these are all beings who have recognized their own innate divinity and that they are a part of a larger consciousness. So this lesson is about the I Am God circuit, and it is also about redefining death. Because when one understands that one is part of a much, much larger entity of consciousness, and that you are a tiny little spark within a brain that is so large it is difficult for you to even conceive of, then you do not look at the exiting of this wormhole as death. You look at it as rejoining yourself and having an opportunity to have even more consciousness. Now that we've spoken so much about consciousness and awareness, we have to talk a little bit about anti-awareness. Because not that I am fostering duality, but I must tell you about the beings that occupy the interstices. So I know that I drew the super magnified version of the membrane of death here. And if these are the final moments of person's existence, and it does not make you a bad person to die. This is like, when I'm drawing these time experiences and everything, and there's the idea that through merit, you gain the capacity to pass through the wormhole. That is very true, but it is not judgmental. I'm not saying that people who lived and then had residual experiences and exist here and have that, a red final moment that needs to be unfurled. That is not a judgment. That is not saying that they are bad or wrong in any way. It's just saying that they were the wrong shape to exit the wormhole. However, the beings that exist, those orange beings that exist here in the interstices and that refuse to move. So like these red beings, these are people that have lived as existence and gotten to their moment of death, and then they're in the process of being washed away, right? But these orange beings up here are beings who never really had corporeal existence. And they never became fully submerged here in the density where you can actually learn. That's what this is. It is food for your soul. When you are able to have these experiences and go through the refinery and process your consciousness, it is food for your soul. And the food is food of unconditional love. It's green. It's the level of unconditional love here. Beings that have never gone through this refinery of consciousness, they do not have the capacity to eat love. Like, let's say love exists here in this realm, and they don't have a mouth that can eat green food. They only can eat the lower vibrational energy that comes from beings who have experienced a more dense realm. And we're talking, I've spoken about this in many, many other classes, many other lessons. It's all about lower vibrational, heavier, denser emotions, sadness, rage, anger, sorrow, and all of the life circumstances that create those experiences. Well, I need to talk a little bit about those orange beings because they are just as much a part of this circuit of God and ascended mastery. And it's kind of like saying, like, people in the New Age teaching world often speak about calling upon the ascended masters. So this is the whole point. If it's just like saying, if I create an object here in the third dimension, that object casts a shadow. This is the shadow of the third dimensional object. And this life as an ascended master casts a shadow. It is the unintended lower dimensional byproduct of the thing that you're making. So here in this case, the thing we have made is a third dimensional cube. A lower dimensional version of a cube is a flat two-dimensional shadow. So these beings that live here in the interstice, they are like the flat two-dimensional shadow selves of these higher dimensional masters. And this has everything to do with your daily experience of being attacked by demons all the time. This has everything to do with humanity's experience of being subjugated under overlords for tens of thousands of years, and humanity's current bid for freedom, both on an individual and collective basis. Because the beings that have been oppressing humanity over here, those beings are actually the lower vibrational selves of beautiful beings that are of pure love. These people that are in alignment with divinity and who know exactly who they are. And I spoke at the very end of the previous lesson, and that's why I'm elaborating here, about in self-defense against negative thought entities, sending these orange beings into the sun for reprocessing. So this is like saying, you know, these beings that are stuck here, they've not had to face the music for a very long time. When you, at the end of your life, you know, when you die and you reach this membrane of death, that is the reckoning. That is when you are unmade, you literally look at everything that you have experienced, everything you've thought, everything you've done, and all the consequences of that. And that's part, that insight that is gained from that is part of what helps you to redirect your journey in greater and greater alignment towards this central timeline. You learn each time you die, just like that movie Groundhog's Day. And of course, as I've described, when you have reached this core persona, you don't have to let go of who you are in order to exit that reality and go through the wormhole. You don't have to let go of who you are, because who you are, you identify with your true divine nature, your true loving being. Basically like saying, if God were in a body, who God would be in the time and place that you find yourself. That is what it's like saying. You live as a perfect conduit and exemplar of God. You are God. You are that higher dimensional entity that has little tiny, tiny neurons inside of it. And you are a little tiny nerve impulse jumping across that synaptic gap. These orange beings are beings who totally have forgotten that they are God. They are pretty much diametrically opposed or in the opposite direction, or they have been cast away from the source for so long that they have become so heavily distorted, it's hard for them to even remember or imagine that that's who they are. And when I spoke about sending them into the sun, when you take this being over here and you send it into the sun, sending it to the sun can mean sending it to our nearest star, the Sol of the solar system, or it can mean sending it to the great central galactic sun. So at the center of our galaxy, there's a supermassive black hole, and here's all the arms of the Milky Way galaxy rotating around it. That is the real source of consciousness. So this sun over here is just the local broadcasting tower of this galactic sun that is here. And that's what we're really doing. We are really taking these negative consciousnesses over here that are stuck, and they have been stuck for a very long time, and their refusal to move and grow and face their karma is what has caused humans to be continually farmed for negativity. These guys over here are why humans have disease. These beings over here created cancer and viruses and every single other disease that arises when your chakras are out of alignment instead of being perfectly in alignment. All of the anxiety, mental diseases, and basic degradation of your mental functioning is because of these beings who do not have physical bodies, cannot eat regular solid food and refine it into light and consciousness, and instead choose to feed off of you, a being who does have a body, and you worked very hard to grow your fetus and to be born and to be conscious in the third dimensional realm. It is a great challenge, and you're also having to go through this whole system of refinery. That's another part of it. You don't just dip your toe into the pool of reality and then get out easily. You dip your toe in, your whole foot comes in, your whole leg comes in, your whole body comes in, and then you're here. And you're here, and you're here, and you're here circulating your consciousness until you finally find that little wormhole to exit. So it is a commitment of your consciousness to be here. And these orange entities that are stuck in the interstices, they cannot be fully in the denser realm of, the third dimension and eat physical food, and they don't have a wormhole to get out of to get back to the source. So it requires assistance to send them back to the sun. And when they are sent back to the sun, I drew in the previous lesson how if you're perfectly in alignment with the sun's emanations, then you don't get erased, you get energized. If this being here is in perfect alignment and I send her into the sun, I would simply be totally putting her into perfect alignment. Look at how perfectly all of those things match with her chakras. And of course, if it were a being who's not in alignment and I send them into the sun, it pretty much unmakes them. And what is that? What does that mean? What is the significance of that? This being here, this orange being, it might have lived for thousands or millions of years and accumulated continuity of consciousness. A being that's lived for 1,000,000 years, but it only lived there because it's been hiding out in the interstices. It's not the same as these beings here that are ascended masters, or this overarching consciousness, this eternal consciousness, the undying consciousness of the much larger entity, which we could call Christ consciousness, we could call it many different things. So these orange entities that have up until now been occupying the interstices, when I say I send them into the sun, I redirect their consciousness. First of all, I recognize who they are. I say, I see you. I know who you are. I know you're trying to feed off of me. I know you're trying to create a emotional residue that you can consume. Not only will I not allow you to consume it, and I've spoken about that in previous lessons about how to avoid producing food for them, but also I'm going to lovingly take your consciousness and I'm going to send it to the sun. And you're going to take a sun bath. And as all of those solar rays penetrate your consciousness, they are going to wash away anything that isn't really you. And at the end of it, there might be a tiny spark of goodness, or it might just wash everything away. And in that sense, this is also to give you, the audience that is currently listening, a lot of hope, because things are really radically changing. The more that those beings are erased away, the more that energy flows properly in the universe. People don't think of death as a good thing, but death is very necessary. This flowing membrane of death, flowing properly, that shows that energy is circulating around the chakras properly. This is the chakra right here. This is it. I didn't draw that properly. This is the membrane right here. You want that energy to be flowing. You don't want it to be stuck in some place like that. You want it to be flowing, and we want that energy to be flowing around the entire entity of God consciousness that we exist within. And this has everything to do with the story of how did consciousness become so distorted? How did it become fractured? How did it become splintered away? Because really, in a much, much larger sense, these beings, these, orange entities that are located in the interstices, were at one point part of this source consciousness, because everything came from the source. So these guys over here also came from up here, but they ended up being in a distorted position. So this has everything to do with how to deal with these beings, which are really aspects of self. Now we're talking about the larger entity. So you and me, we can say, well, my personal individual ego is comprised of, if my ego is a yellow box, I'm comprised of a little bit of this and a little bit of this and then, a dash of this. Well, what is the consciousness, personality, persona of this larger blue box made of? Well, it's made up of all of these individual aspects of self that have been refined. And when I say aspects of self, like here's one aspect of self that is an example: tenacity. The capacity to really hold on and not give up and keep going no matter what. That's like an aspect of self. And it is an aspect of self that is worthy of going on because it helps consciousness to get from out here back to here. Tenacity means I'm not going to be stuck out here, I'm going to make it back here. And there are other personality characteristics that are helpful in the success of consciousness on its journey. And then there are some personality characteristics that don't serve. So all of this refinement here on an ego level is all about each one of us figuring out the recipe of personality characteristics that serves the much larger entity. Because this larger entity, it needs some amount of tenacity, but it also needs some amount of, let's say, receptivity. You have to be receptive and be open to other ideas. And you also have to have your own structure and your own inner, we would call it backbone because we're vertebrate, but your own inner sense of, yes, I'm going to do this. And that has to do with the story of how these orange entities became so outcast. Because, the idea of being an explorer and going away from source, that is positive. If nothing ever wanted to explore, nothing would ever go away from source. Everything would still be stuck here. So that's a positive personality characteristic. But if your tendency to want to explore means that you think you want to never return and you want to be stuck in your exploration for forever, that is not a positive personality characteristic, because it means that little spark of God over here doesn't make it back to the source. So there are a lot of implications. This is a very heavy or meaty or juicy topic, and I'm at the end of this segment. Please tune in for segment 2.